Well, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Korea Compass series at the Korea Economic Institute. My name is Sarah Yoon, Director of Public Affairs and Regional Issues here at KEI. And I think that there's no better day to hold this a very, very unique and interesting program on other than December 12th, 2012 at 12 p.m. So it's 12. And the world hasn't ended. We're still around.
And it's 12:12, actually.
Oh, it's 12:12. Oh, my goodness. So it's 12 times 5. So with that said, welcome to the 6th installment of the Korea Compass series, which looks at Korea's engagements around the world, especially with developing countries and regions. And today, KEI is very honored to host 2 distinguished speakers, Dr. Balbina Hwang and Dr. Alicia Campi, to discuss Korea's growing relationship and expanding ties with Central Asia and Mongolia, and possible implications for the United States, since we are in Washington, D.C. So before starting the presentations, I will introduce the speakers to you briefly. You also have their bios in the booklet. And also, I'd like to point that there is a paper that you received in your way, which includes both of their papers on the topics that they will discuss during the presentation. They're also on our website, and we will compile all of the Korea Compass paper series into an online magazine at the beginning of next year. So please be on the lookout for that. So our first speaker will be Dr. Balbina Hwang, who's a visiting professor at Georgetown University, where she teaches Asian political economy. She's also currently an adjunct research fellow at the Institute for National Security Strategy in Seoul, Korea. From 2007 to January 2009, many of you know that she served as the senior special advisor to Ambassador Christopher Hill, Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the State Department. From 2009 to 2010, she taught at the National Defense University, and prior to that, she was also the senior policy analyst for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. She earned her PhD in government from Georgetown University, master's in international affairs from Columbia University, and MBA from Darden Business School at University of Virginia. She was very busy studying. Dr. Alicia Campi is to my immediate right, will speak second, and she is a former State Department officer who has been a leading scholar in Mongolia issues for many years. Since March 2007, Dr. Campi has been the president of the Mongolia Society of Bloomington, Indiana, which I just learned that has been around for 52 years, which is very impressive. In 1991, she founded the U.S. Mongolia Advisory Group, a company specializing in finding Mongolian partners for Western companies. She also established a private charity called the Chinggis Khan Foundation, and is also the executive director and vice president of Northeast Asia, InterAsia, which is a consulting company. Dr. Campi received her MA in East Asian Studies with a concentration in Mongolian Studies from Harvard University, and a PhD in Mongolian Studies from Indiana University. So it's clear that both of our speakers are very well recognized and respected, and also widely published, and very, very busy people. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hwang first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to see you all here. I don't know if I can maybe move this up. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Sarah very much for putting together this program and this idea. I think I recognize many of the faces here. You may recall that we were here earlier this year. I think, was it in the spring?
March.
In March. And interestingly enough, this is really the second series, correct? In the Korea Compass?
It's the 6th, actually.
Oh, it's the 6th.
But you were here for the second or third. Yes.
Okay, so the second. So what's fascinating is that this is, well, for me, the second, in that the other one that I participated in was Korea's role in Southeast Asia. And it's fascinating to me because this is the other anchor in Korea's global role. And so for me, this is an ongoing theme. But I really congratulate Sarah because I think this shows the breadth of not only KEI's accomplishments, but certainly highlights the role that South Korea has been playing globally. And do we have, oh great, we have the map up there. So actually, I think we should start, and I'm glad that's up there basically as the wallpaper. And if you're anything like me, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I'm actually new to the stands. I'm by no means an expert on Central Asia. I certainly would not claim to be. And when I started to do this research, that was the first thing that I did was look this up. And I was a little bit astonished, actually, when I saw this, certainly because I was a little overwhelmed by the size of Kazakhstan. But you'll also notice that Central Asia is nowhere near the Korean Peninsula. There's something else very remarkable about Central Asia that you'll notice. And let me start by, generally the definition is these 5 republics of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. I've purposely left Afghanistan out because for a whole bunch of reasons, it actually qualifies as a whole separate discussion, which is relatively obvious. But the remarkable significance is that in many ways there are so many similarities to the Korean Peninsula. And that is that, like the Korean Peninsula, these 5 republics are a victim of geography. That for centuries, thousands of years, they are essentially a victim of geography. They are located at the strategic crossroads of great empires. And much like the Korean Peninsula, location, location, location. They are both, it's been both a curse and a boon. And unfortunately, they cannot pick up and move. And for centuries, it has both been a curse and a boon, as I've said. Interestingly, also for centuries, much like the Korean Peninsula, they have been valued for their strategic value and not for their intrinsic value. And what I mean by that is, until very recently, all the great empires which have surrounded them have fought over possession of these geographic territories for their strategic value. Because possession or control over these territories has meant access and has meant power, much as the Korean Peninsula has. And interestingly, it has only been very recently that these territories have actually meant something in terms of their intrinsic value. Now, interestingly enough, for these central republics, much of it has actually, it's been discovered that these territories have a great deal of intrinsic value in terms of the resources that are contained within these lands that for a very long time have been considered desolate, right? And it's because of all of these natural resources that are buried beneath them. What are the intrinsic value on the Korean Peninsula? Actually, still nothing. I mean, the Korean Peninsula is really endowed with very little natural resources. What has been remarkable about South Korea, the Republic of Korea, is that South Korea has actually created its own intrinsic value. And by that, I actually mean its culture. And the fact that South Korea has essentially, in the last several decades, created its own value. And that is the value of its culture and the value of its high-tech economy, and actually the value of its entire society. So this has actually been the remarkable revolution that's occurred, and frankly, the linkage between these two regions, and really the basis that I'd like to talk about in terms of the strategic linkage of these two regions. Now, I think they all have a copy of the paper, so I don't necessarily want to go into all the details and specific statistics, since you all have it there, and instead I'd just like to cover some of these strategic relationships. And really actually discuss how it is and why it is that South Korea has, in fact, reached out, and why it is, in fact, focusing on Central Asia and how it fits into Korea's global strategy. Now, as I mentioned, Central Asia has been the key to this entire linkage between essentially East and West. And for South Korea, Central Asia, in many ways, has been rediscovered. The relationship actually goes back quite a number of years. Some of you may be very surprised to learn this. Others of you may have known a little bit of this quirky history. But do you all know about the relationship with Kazakhstan? Okay, so some of you know this, others it may come as a total shock, that in the 1930s, an entire population of ethnic Koreans was forcibly removed from the Russian Far East to the territory that is now, it's today, the Kazakh Republic. This was during the years of the Stalin period, about 170,000 ethnic Koreans. They were forcibly removed, which is why today there are so many ethnic Koreans that reside there. I had actually heard these stories. I think it's quite well known for many Koreans to grow up having heard this. What shocked me, though, and surprised me, is that I actually did not realize that there are more ethnic Koreans living in Uzbekistan today than Kazakhstan. So that was a figure that actually surprised me. In any case, I think those ethnic ties in many ways have drawn an emotional tie to Kazakhstan. But what did surprise me is that the sort of breadth of economic and cultural and political ties that have developed, particularly in recent years. And I think much of the credit does go to President Lee Myung-bak, who in 2009 launched this New Asia Initiative, which was a very specific and concerted strategy that was in line with his vision of a global Korea. Now, I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the strategy. And again, it was in line with his very, very broad vision of using the platform of Korea's position to really link Korea's position, but use it in a leadership capacity to create linkages and as a middle power to reach out to different parts of the globe in both the economy, but politically, and also, of course, culturally. Now, at the core of the New Asia Initiative is South Korea's belief that it can play a bridging role between the large powers and the small powers. And I think this is actually the critical piece of the New Asia Initiative. And of course, the most successful manifestation of this, part of it was coincidental, but I do think it was President Lee's initiative, was his hosting of the G20 summit. And in this regard, it was really a very specific manifestation of Korea's middle role, not just economically, but also politically. And I think it was actually quite successful. And we see this throughout, not just in Southeast Asia, but again also in Central Asia. Now, why is this so important? Well, I think it's important in Central Asia because, again, much like the Korean Peninsula's historical experience, Central Asia has been very much a victim of great power influence and great power dominance. And so in the 20 years that they have been independent from the Soviet Union, they are still very much struggling to find their own identity and very much struggling to find their own independence, but obviously having great difficulty, not just economically, but politically. And so it requires, obviously, a great deal of support, but it's very, very difficult under the shadow of not only Russia, but China, particularly given the economic power of China. And so I think in this regard, South Korea plays a very, very critical role. And what you have in addition to that, again, if you look at this map, it's really critical because particularly when you see that not only are these central republics overshadowed by Russia and China to the north, but by Iran and Afghanistan to the south. And of course, you also have Pakistan, as well as India. So in essence, what you also have is the shadow of the United States. And the United States plays a particularly complex role because of its involvement to the south, but its ambivalence in terms of because of the political uncertainty of the central republics and the U.S., shall we say, indecision or ambivalence about how much they want to get involved in the Central Republics, you actually essentially have a vacuum that allows China's assertion of economic power. And so I believe what you have is a Central Asian republic's hunger for an alternative to Russian dominance, an alternative to Chinese dominance, and of course South Korean influence can be quite small relative, but it certainly offers in many ways almost a neutral alternative to these powers. And so the compatibility offers a very intriguing opportunity. Now, how am I doing on time, Sarah? Should I?
About 10.
About 10 minutes? Okay. So maybe I can talk a little bit about some of these complementarities then, and actually what South Korea has been doing. Now, let's see, where should we start? Actually, let me start with Uzbekistan. So now these Central Republics obviously were quite undeveloped. In many ways, they were quite neglected by the Soviet Union. They were essentially utilized by the Soviet Union as partially as the breadbasket. Many of them were they were essentially pillaged or used just to dig out all of the natural resources for their uranium, for their coal, for all of the industries. And so the infrastructure was quite neglected during the Soviet Union years. And again, it has only been recently that all of these natural resources have been discovered. And so there's been this recent boom, this rush to go in and try to develop on massive scale these incredible resources that are to be found. And in fact, some of these areas, Kazakhstan, for example, it's been predicted that Kazakhstan may hold one of the world's largest reserves of oil and natural gas. And so suddenly you've got these countries that have potentially some of the richest resources in the world, and some of the rarest minerals as well. And so, for example, in Uzbekistan, there are deposits of uranium and other very, very rare minerals that could potentially be incredible boons to these countries. And so what you see is this incredible rush by many, many countries to go in and develop this at breakneck speed. Now, of course, the problem is that for many of these countries, they've only been essentially independent for 20 years. And so these governments are not particularly well developed. They don't have a very long history of institutionalization. To say their democratic structures are undeveloped is to be diplomatic, to say the least. Do we have any representatives from any of those countries here? No? Okay. So I kind of wish there were. We could have a little bit more of an open conversation. But anyway, so I mean, they clearly politically they are undergoing still a process of much needed reform, and unfortunately, many of these countries, it's not going in the right direction. And some countries are doing a little bit better than others. In other countries, they are not necessarily going in the right direction. They are also, unfortunately, suffering from some serious unrest, as well as ethnic and religious clashes. And so there are concerns about instability. So those are serious concerns. Frankly, for countries like South Korea, that are trying to go in and invest, these are very serious concerns and will have impact. And this is a consideration when you're talking about a country like South Korea going in to invest for the long term, compared to a country like China or Russia, frankly, because South Korea, the South Korean government will, and South Korean companies will have to take these considerations into account, unlike Chinese state-owned enterprises, frankly, which don't. So that is actually another consideration. Let's see. Now, again, I don't think I necessarily want to go through all of these figures because they are all in the paper. Maybe I'll just wrap up by talking about this sort of great game. And so in the paper, what I address is this idea that what we are seeing is kind of the second stage of the great game. I mean, this is sort of the lyrical idea that was put forth back in the, well, I guess it was 19th century or even earlier to describe the idea that this region was essentially a chessboard. And it was the area in which all the great empires were essentially focused on how they would carve up the area for control. And in fact, that this was the key to controlling the world, because whoever controlled this meant the balance of power. And I think in many ways, this is basically where we are today. Now, obviously not necessarily militarily the way it was several centuries ago, but certainly economically. And again, if you look at the map, you could actually argue it is also politically and militarily. Because again, we are talking about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. You are talking about an area that is surrounded by nuclear powers, much like the Korean Peninsula is. And you're talking about a region that because it is still unstable, if things go wrong, it has the potential to be literally the balance of stability for the rest of the world. And so, again, while South Korea is a small power, certainly, compared to China, the United States, and Russia, it has a very interesting role to play as a pivot. And so I would personally argue that South Korea has a very positive role to play. I don't think South Korea's role is negative. And if it can continue, I think it can only be positive. I certainly think it has to be cautious, and there are certainly challenges ahead, but it's certainly beneficial, and it's beneficial to South Korea. And I guess let me actually just add by talking a little bit about that, because I guess I didn't really talk about that. So why is South Korea getting involved? Well, it's not just, obviously, because it's some magnanimous gesture. There's a lot of complementarities for South Korea. It is a region that is not contiguous, obviously, to the Korean Peninsula, but it does fit in very well with South Korea's strategic interests. It fits in with its commercial and economic interests. It fits in with its political interests, and frankly, fits in with its global interests. Economically, this region makes sense. And there's a reason why so many countries are scrambling to rush into this region. I mean, it's not just the great powers, but Australia, Canada, all the European countries are rushing in. Why? Again, because of the natural resources. And again, some of them are very valuable, including the minerals. Now, South Korea has done something very interesting. It has built a critical airport, the Navoy airport in Uzbekistan. Why is this airport so critical? It's actually serving as a transportation hub. And this transportation hub is absolutely critical, not just for its physical location, because it serves some of the critical resource processing areas, but it's a place where they can, for example, access some of the uranium that gets mined. By the way, Sarah, when she read my paper, was asking me, well, how does that actually help if it's not near any of the railways, or how are they actually going to transport over land? It turns out uranium is actually shipped by air. And so this is actually a really, really smart idea. By the way, so they lease it out to all the allies as well. So, and once they get this transportation hub going, this is actually how Uzbekistan ends up building the infrastructure for the rest of its economy. So this is the engine that gets the rest of its economy going. And it kickstarts all the surrounding Asian republics as well. And it's the hub that gets the railways that link several other republics. So Korea's been doing this very, very strategically. So number one, it's obviously about the resources. There is absolutely no doubt. But again, it's also about creating linkages in the economic supply chain and in expanding in a region that is dependent is sort of bypassing China, so that the South Korean economy is no longer just dependent on China, so that South Korea can then expand into Southeast Asia, into Central Asia, and eventually connect through to Europe, and hopefully also into Africa. And finally, there's something to be said about South Korea trying to help and develop emerging countries, not just economically, but politically. So countries that are developing and emerging democratically. And that's actually a really critical and important model. Everybody knows Korea's success story as an economic development model. Everybody knows that. That's actually, in some ways, it's an old story, right? But, and you know, China. And now everybody talks about following China's model. But that's really now the kind of dividing story. People can either follow China's model or they can actually follow South Korea's model. So, in other words, countries can say, okay, well, we can either develop like China and continue to use that as an excuse to be authoritarian, or they can actually follow South Korea's model and become democratic. And I think that's actually the shining beacon that South Korea has to offer. And frankly, that is actually the hope that South Korea can offer the Central Asian republics. Now, again, maybe that is a little bit too hopeful for Central Asia. And again, the trend that's going in Central Asia doesn't seem to really be following that model. And I'm a little bit too much of a cynic to think that it might actually work. However, that doesn't mean that South Korea shouldn't try. And so, in any case, I do think it is something that South Korea should constantly try to sell as it moves forward. I think the rest we'll just leave it open to the discussion.
Sure,
I'm sure people
a lot
will
of territory to
Yeah,
cover.
it is. So I'm sure people have
So,
specific questions. So I'll leave that open.
Thank you, Dr. Hwang. Next, we'll go to Mongolia.
Thank you to the Korean Economic Institute for inviting me and including Mongolia in this topic. In some ways, it's very interesting because maybe this shines a light on what Korea thinks about Mongolia. Mongolia and many other nations surrounding it do not consider Mongolia a Central Asian nation. I'm one of the few people who have encouraged Mongolian policymakers to look at themselves as both a Northeast Asian nation and a Central Asian nation. But that is a minority opinion in Mongolia. Most of the Koreans that I've met at international conferences have also considered Mongolia a Northeast Asian nation. So putting it here in this topic is an interesting challenge for me, and I think also may indicate more of, let's say, an American point of view. I go this way. All right, so as you can see, this is how Mongolia sees itself. And unlike Dr. Hwang's presentation, I am not going to tell you what Korea necessarily thinks and plans about Mongolia. I'm going to open you all to the world of what Mongolia thinks about Korea. And in some ways, these worldviews are very different. But Mongolia is a unique country. It is a bridge country. It is a country with a long imperial tradition. It was a superpower. It sees itself in many ways still as a superpower, yet it is weak. It is between other superpowers. And so it has, particularly since 1990, when it once again was able to be in control of its foreign affairs policy, it has developed a very interesting, although I would say for most countries in the world, including South Korea and the United States, a confusing foreign and economic policy. Mongolia is a landlocked country covering an area of 1.56 million square kilometers, and it is the 17th largest country in the world. With a small and young population, it has a population of about 2.8 million in 2010, two-thirds of whom are under the age of 35. So all the government officials, the policymakers, if they are 50, they are considered old. It's a young country. So right there's a difference with how Koreans perceive power and decision-making. Today, the nation has a $10 billion economy, two-thirds of which comes from foreign investment, mostly in its mineral resources in the past 10 years. This is the 22nd year of South Korean-Mongolian bilateral diplomatic relations, and now prospects for economic and trade ties, particularly in the fields of civil nuclear cooperation, natural resource development, rail transportation, and construction, are very strong and expanding. South Korea is Mongolia's third largest trading partner, with bilateral trade volume amounting to $230 million in 2011, an 85-fold increase from 2.71 million in 1990. And yet, Korea is a very minor trade partner for Mongolia. China controls more than 80% of its trade, and 93% of Mongolian exports go to China. Now, the growth in ROK Mongolian ties is especially noteworthy within the context of the continuing strength of Mongolia's historical relationship with North Korea. Just today, the Georgetown Foundation released an article I wrote on Mongolian DPRK relations and its effect possibly on the six-party talks. In 1948, Mongolia became the second country after the Soviet Union to recognize the Pyongyang regime. Since then, Mongolia and North Korea have exchanged frequent high-level state visits coupled with strong people-to-people and cultural contacts. The relationship survived Mongolia's diplomatic recognition of the ROK in 1990 and the even greater shock of Mongolia's public endorsement of Seoul's Sunshine Policy in June 1999. In the last decade, the Mongols have worked assiduously to strengthen their DPRK relationship while growing ROK economic ties. One successful example of this relationship is the movement in Mongolia to import North Korean labor instead of Chinese into Mongolia for construction, textile, and mining-related projects. In 2012, the Mongols, at the request of the North, hosted secret talks between Japan and DPRK on March 17 and 18, and again on November 15 and 16, which are indications of the depth of trust that the North holds in Mongolia. Now, there is genetic and linguistic strong ties between the Korean people and the Mongolian people. There's the famous blue spot on the back of infants, the strongest element of that spot, which is consistent throughout Uralic and Altaic peoples to some extent, exists in Mongol babies. As well as we have linguistic connections, you have historical ties. The Koryo dynasty was subject to the Mongol Empire. So we have a lot of historical previous relationships. But it is absolutely true that right now we are looking at a relationship with South Korea and Mongolia that is much stronger and wider in scope than what exists today with the North. And the reason for this is because it's connected to what Mongolia calls its third neighbor strategy. As you can see, Mongolia actually only has two border neighbors, geographical neighbors, China and Russia. And so with democracy in 1990, it came up with this third neighbor strategy, which is a multilateral approach. It's not connected to Mongolian party. So it's a general agreed upon approach of a variety of policymakers and think tank people to strengthen Mongolia's political, military, and economic engagement beyond its physical borders and to avoid dependence on one partner. It has failed economically because, as I just said, China monopolizes its economy. So now it is in the midst of a reanalysis of what Mongolia can do to make its economic policy not so one party, meaning Chinese dependent. Now, politically and militarily, this policy or strategy has been much more successful. Mongolia is now an active member of the global community, whereas before it was very definitely not a member of the global community under the shadow of the Soviet Union. But economically, in the past 20 years, this policy has not worked. We've moved from 93% of all of our trade in 1990 with Russia to 80+% of all of our trade with China. So this policy, as you can see from the facts, Mongolian policymakers and leaders from all political persuasions are not happy with. So we're trying to change things, and South Korea is looked at now as one example of both a modern democratic free market economy and as perhaps a partner that can get them out of the economic bind they're in with China. Now, the variety of relationships, ups and downs between South Korea and Mongolia, even in 20 years, but because of time, I wanted to focus mostly on the last 10 years. Mongolia, frankly, in 1990, had tremendous hopes for its relationship with South Korea. I was there in Ulaanbaatar talking with the presidents and prime ministers, and we know that the Mongols had great interest in the South Korean experiment. Frankly, things didn't work out the way Mongolia expected in the 1990s, and that was connected to the Asian economic crisis, but also perhaps from what Dr. Hwang talked about, this concept that the Koreans came in and saw themselves as a shining beacon, that maybe they could teach Mongolia. And in reality, they can teach Mongolia, but Mongolians don't like to be told that they've been caught, that you're there to teach them exactly like that. So I would like to single out in May 1999 the ROK President Kim Dae-jung's visit to Ulaanbaatar as a reset of the relationship. And this summit became a catalyst for expanding the scope of the economic relationship when the countries established an Energy and Mineral Resources Cooperation Joint Committee to encourage cooperation in the field of mining. And this council continues to meet annually. In 1991, bilateral trade between Mongolia and the ROK was only $8.8 million. By 1997, it was only 23 some million dollars. And during this period of time, Korea was sending to Mongolia cars, SUVs, and consumer goods, and Mongolian exports were even less than the few Korean imports. Mongolian exports were mostly in minerals, meaning gold, and ready-made garments. There was a trade surge in 1998 because Korean textile manufacturers moved to Mongolia to take advantage of its free trade status quota with the U.S. But then, after really 1 year, this trade boost fell back. But Kim's visit sparked more investment, and since that time, in the past 10 years, we've had a 4-time increase in trade volume. South Korea is now Mongolia's fourth largest investor of FDI, with a total of over 255 million. Moreover, South Korea became a key donor to Mongolia through the Korean International Cooperation Agency's grant aid and technical aid program, and now, after 20 years, this has amounted to $137 million in committed loans and grants. And that's ranks about fifth or sixth among donor countries for Mongolia. The Korean cultural and educational programs have impacted Mongolia from the very beginning of the bilateral relationship. In fact, in 2009, then Prime Minister Batbold in Mongolia declared that the most important aspect of Mongolian ROK relations is human exchanges. And there have been hundreds of Korean government college scholarships given to Mongolia, for example. But the most importantly for Mongolia during the past 10 years, but actually beginning in the second half of the 1990s, was that Korea permitted Mongolian citizens to go to Korea to work in low-wage factories. It's estimated that today there are 38 to 40,000 Mongolian citizens working in these factories, as well as many thousands of illegal overstay workers. This situation has been a great boon economically, but of course it's also a strain in the relationship between the two countries. Mongols are concerned about what they feel are abusive working conditions, and the ROK government is concerned about the illegal overstay problem. Other irritants in the relationship have been expanding air flights into the two countries and how to establish a no visa at all policy. The early investors in Mongolia were Hyundai and Kia Motors and a big shopping center called Sky. Samsung was working with Mongolia's largest operating copper mine, Erdenet, since the beginning of the 1990s. And Erdenet is the major contributor to the Mongolian budget today. It's a joint venture with Russia. Major South Korean investments I have listed here in this PowerPoint slide. And you can see they are in telecommunications, services, and construction of residential housing. And now this Mongolian Development Bank, which the Korean Development Bank will be part of the management team, that is going to be the bank that will loan all the money to the major development of these huge mineral deposits that Mongolia is bringing online. In August 2011, President Lee Myung-bak made a 3-day state visit to Mongolia, and that is when the partnership between the two countries was upgraded to what is called a comprehensive partnership. The two leaders agreed to a midterm action plan developing energy and natural resources into expanding Korean investment in Mongolia's infrastructure and construction sectors by building 100,000 apartment units. They also increased high-level personnel visits to bolster diplomatic cooperation and to hold high-level ministerial exchanges and talks. Among important new agreements made in this 2011 trip were a preliminary deal between Korea's Ministry of Knowledge Economy and the Mongolian government to strengthen technological exchanges for thermal power generation, development of renewable energy and co-friendly fuels, joint forestation project to prevent desertification in Mongolia, and natural resources exploration. Visa simplification and Mongolian support, quote, for Seoul's efforts to resolve the nuclear issue and resume dialogue with Pyongyang, end of quote, were discussed. Now, the major areas now of cooperation, economic cooperation between Mongolia and South Korea are in a few certain sectors. Now, the first one is the fuel and civil nuclear cooperation area. Mongolia's Ministry of Mineral Resources and Energy in April of this year established a long-term contract with a new nonprofit partner called M Oil Group, which consists of Hyundai Oil Bank and SK Energy. And this will supply low sulfur dioxide fuel products. In April, the first several thousand tons of oil were imported from South Korea. And Mongolia is also looking to utilize South Korean methods to refine crude petroleum. The reason for this is because Mongolian is seeking to diversify from the fact that 93% of all of its fuel comes from Russia today. The general director of Mongolian Nuclear Energy Agency made an official visit to the Korea Nuclear International Cooperation Foundation in December of this year to discuss nuclear issues. Previously, these discussions between Korea and Mongolia were done through third parties, such as the Japanese, sometimes the Americans, or the IAEA. Some of you may know of secret negotiations held in Tokyo in May 2011, which involved uranium exploitation and possible waste management issues. But officially, the two countries say that Mongolia is interested in obtaining Korean radiation monitoring equipment and studying how to use radiation-based equipment for medical usefulness. And also, Mongolians want the Koreans to discuss how you educate your public about the usefulness of nuclear energy. As recently as August, there were seminars held in Ulaanbaatar between Korea and Mongolia about nuclear power cooperation. And both sides have examined potential areas for cooperation, including nuclear power safety and training, smart, small, and medium capacity nuclear reactors, nuclear medicine, and radiation technology. The second major area of economic cooperation is in minerals. Mongolia has a tremendous number of minerals. The KCH Industry Development Company, Korea's biggest investment company, signed a memorandum of understanding in 2008 to facilitate mineral investments. Right now, the major investment that everybody is talking about is something that's called Tavan Tolgoi. And Tavan Tolgoi is predicted to be the world's largest undeveloped coal and gold deposit. And Korean companies have bid on being players in the development of this deposit. But frankly, there's not very much movement on this. Korean investors have been told you will not be shortlisted, and the Mongolian government is pressuring them to join with the Russians and work in this development. Another major area is rail construction. Discussion between the two governments on rail began in 2009, and in 2011, a 19-member South Korean consortium led by Korean Rail Network Authority and builders such as Daewoo, Hyundai, and Lotte signed a preliminary deal with Mongolian Railways to build over the next 5 years a 3 billion, 1,000-kilometer railway from Tavan Tolgoi mining site to Choibasan City, which then links to the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So this is the one map I wanted to, can you turn that on? Okay. What I wanted to show is, here's Tavan Tolgoi, that's the big coal deposit. Oyo Tolgoi is now operating, beginning operation, huge copper deposit. Up here, Erdenet is the ongoing Soviet-era copper deposit, the major money order now. So we only have one rail that goes north-south, Russian gauge, and connects to the Trans-Siberian. So what the plan is for the Korean companies to work to build a line here and it goes from Tavan Tolgoi to this place called Sainshan, where there will be a new industrial park, and from Sainshan up here to the Mongolian border, and then there will be another spur built so that products can be taken out to Asian countries and we can diversify our customer base from China. Also, the Koreans have been active in Mongolian power plant construction as well as other residential construction. Late September of this year, it was announced that Korea's POSCO Energy, together with France, Japan, and a Mongolian company, are going to construct a $1.3 billion coal power plant that will supply power to the city of Ulaanbaatar, thus again breaking the Russian hold on Mongolian power. This will be the biggest foreign investment in Mongolia outside the mining sector. And the final area that I wanted to mention where the Koreans have a special niche is in medical technology and training. They've been working in this field for several years, and now we have a new National Diagnostics Center which will be constructed with a soft loan of $55 million from the Korean Exim Bank. And we have training of doctors back and forth between the two countries. So just to briefly conclude, this year, if you look at the Mongolian Press, you see constantly streams of delegations of Korean businessmen going back and forth representing construction, IT, electronics, tourism, and logistics, trying to expand ties with Mongolian businesses. The Embassy of Korea in June organized a meeting with Mongolia's National Development and Innovation Committee with Korean companies such as KEPCO, Korean Air, Samsung, Hyundai, and Hala Construction. In attendance were South Korean investment and business companies primarily interested in rare earth minerals, coal, the railroad, and other railroad and transportation projects. In the same month of June, we had Korea's Institute of Public Finance in Ulaanbaatar sharing their financial management experience. In July, the Korean Development Institute had a delegation to discuss export promotion ideas to help Mongolia's Ministry of Finance increase the number and diversity of Mongolia's export products and to reduce Mongolia's dependency on the mining sector, which is eventually the goal of the government. And finally, we had, at the end of November, right after the secret talks between the DPRK and Japan in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia's foreign minister, Lou Bold, went to Seoul for discussions, and it's likely that he discussed what came out of the six-party talks from their Mongolian point of view. For 20 years in the democratic era, the Mongolian policymakers have felt they could have utilized their own connections with both Koreas to facilitate inter-Korean dialogue and inter-Korean economic exchanges. However, the new strategy for Mongolian policymakers is to encourage South Korean closer economic ties to Russia and even North Korea as a way for Mongolia to more successfully manage its economic development and trade. Although the Mongols understand that the ROK, like Japan, is a U.S. ally and rely on the stability such relationships bring to the Northeast Asian region, nonetheless, they believe that the Russians hold the key to solving Mongolia's rail transportation problems, which inhibit diversification of trade to Asian partners other than China. Korean economic partnerships with American companies are not reassuring to Russia. This is why Mongolia has been promoting ROK Russian collaboration. This strategy may be discomforting and ultimately unrealistic for both the U.S. and the ROK. But the desire to drastically reduce China's monopoly over Mongolia's economy is the key to comprehending why the Mongols value strengthening their relations with Seoul. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both of our speakers for a very informative presentation. There are a couple of microphones going around, and if you have a question, please raise your hand, state your name and your affiliation, and pose a question. Thank you. Up here? Do we have a microphone? No, it's coming around.
Thank you. A question on Central Asia and Korea. A lot of the other Western countries are now reassessing their long-term engagement in Central Asia because of the pullout from Afghanistan. I wasn't sure if that was playing into South Korea's decision-making as well, because as we know, they were somewhat involved in that whole region and recoiled and now come back a bit. So it might have some influence. And then also, is it playing into their thinking about diplomacy with respect to China and Russia and the whole northern outreach, because of that region is generally often thought as being something where Russia has security primacy and China is going to have economic primacy at some point.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think, I think it's somewhat independent. I mean, obviously, it's all interconnected. But I think first and foremost, I don't think we should discount the fact that all the countries' engagement of Central Asia is primarily for economic reasons. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt it is to take advantage of the resources that these Central Asian republics offer, and the reason is primarily for countries like China, Japan, and South Korea. It's because those three countries are, well, China is a different story, but Japan and South Korea are absolutely energy dependent. 97% of their energy resources are externally, they are 97% dependent on imports for their energy resources. That is a fact. And the fact that Japan and South Korea are under increasing pressure by the United States to cut their oil imports from Iran. I mean, 40% of all of their oil imports from abroad used to be from Iran, which are under increasing pressure, obviously, by the United States to be cut. So that puts tremendous pressure on Japan and South Korea. And of course, Japan now has had to reduce all of its nuclear energy. So for South Korea, there is tremendous pressure to find other resources. Now, South Korea has been trying to expand its nuclear facilities. There's, I think, 22 plants, and there's 2 under construction, which means that there's also pressure to increase a steady and stable supply of uranium. So the Central Republics offer a very good source of energy supply. So that is one of the reasons why these republics in particular offer such a good area of energy exploitation. So I think regardless of what's been going on in Afghanistan, I think that these countries would have been racing in. Now, certainly does Afghanistan factor in? Of course it does. So I don't want to say that it's not a factor. And I think it does. It certainly helps that as an ally of the United States, if South Korea can say that by its economic development, that its economic engagement of these republics, that it is contributing to economic development, which then can contribute to stabilization of these countries, which then can contribute to overall stability, which would then help stability of the region, which would contribute to the goals of the United States, I'm sure that certainly helps as well. But I would not say that there is any specific calculation with Afghanistan. Question?
Gentleman in the back.
Well, actually, I'm sorry. I will say, however, that this the development of this facility of the transport hub in Navoy, that actually has been absolutely critical in the operations in Afghanistan. Now, this is actually quite interesting because when South Korea negotiated control of this transportation hub in Navoy, it's actually been very, very helpful to the United States and NATO allies in using these facilities to help transport allied equipment as well. So there actually has been obviously critical support that has been ongoing. So certainly it's contributed. But again, I wouldn't say that it's been a direct immediate calculation going in.
Actually, 3 questions, if I could. First,
Could you identify yourself?
Benjamin Weber from the Atlantic Council. Does South Korea actually and overtly say that some of their assistance, even if it's only in the forms of academic exchange, is about developing civil society or democratic institutions? I mean, is that ever explicitly stated, or is it sort of implicit that, take a look at us, we've had some success? Second, South Korea obviously has not made this an explicit focus, but does have a competent military and intelligence network and arms industry. Is there any security relationship between South Korea and the countries of Central Asia? And then third, is there any economic competition between South Korea and Japan in terms of trying to get resources in the region? Thank you.
Do you want to speak about Mongolia?
I'll speak about Mongolia. Korea's donor aid program, which has been active since 1991, has always said that it's to the Mongols that we are your example of your Asian cousins, because they have a genetic, relationship. Your Asian cousins who have successfully employed free market techniques as well as our democratic society. So it was not subtle, it was very overt, the way the Americans are very overt. And in terms of the competition, Korea and Japan are always in competition in Mongolia. I was making some remarks to Sarah here that when I was last in Mongolia in June, and I had dinner with the Japanese ambassador, who is a Mongolian specialist and I've known for 30 years. We were diplomats together in Ulaanbaatar when the communist government fell. And he's about to retire, and he was bemoaning the fact that he felt that the Japanese relationship with Mongolia was not progressing very well, although I think the past year things have really actually changed quite a bit in that. But he then said everything the Japanese should be doing, the Koreans are doing, and they're taking up, all of the cooperative projects, and I wish Japan were doing as well as Korea.
Sorry, I was trying to find the exact reference in my paper. In fact, as Dr. Campi mentioned, the Korea International Cooperation Agency, KOICA, explicitly, absolutely, not only are they are purposefully doing this as explicit development of civil society. In fact, they have programs and training programs. They bring in bureaucrats from these countries into Seoul for extensive training programs to train them specifically in civil society development. The money is dedicated specifically into going to those countries to develop programs. It's government money, it's development money. It's also done informally through NGOs, so it is absolutely purposeful. In terms of military, I assume, and I could be wrong, I'm assuming that the development is more formal with Mongolia. I came across nothing that says there's any military to military with Central Asia, but I could be wrong, so I'm not familiar with any of that in terms of military. I also came across nothing that says there's any arms sales. I think all of the economic development I've seen have been commercial. And in fact, Dr. Campi mentioned medical. Actually, interestingly, a lot of the commercial ties have been for medical training and also for opening hospitals. Some of them have been private. So I've come across nothing that has been in the arms or security related, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And then, I'm sorry, I forget your last question, but it was a good one. But, the competition with Japan. Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt. And as Dr. Campi said, it's for energy. And there's no doubt that every single one of these bids, all of these, KEPCO, KOGAS, all of these companies that have been bidding for the development of these major, I mean, $1.6 billion, $4 billion projects. They've all been bidding against Japanese companies, some Chinese companies. So they are in direct competition with Japan. But again, it's because a lot of these are for the very resources that Japanese companies or Japan is also trying to get at.
Hwang, right there.
Hi, Hwang Kim from the World Bank. Question actually for, it could be Dr. Hwang, but Dr. Campi could also address, is what type of regional or bilateral, regional assistance strategy for bilateral multilateral support will be more strategic in terms of priorities, areas. You mentioned airport at Uzbekistan. I was in Bishkek last month, and having an airport in Uzbekistan, there's so much competition between these countries. Just the fact that you're building an airport doesn't mean that the Uzbek government is going to easily allow other countries to allow access. So what type of key areas of support will be most strategic for Central Asia countries, or if that's relevant to Mongolia, I would also like to hear from Dr. Campi.
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Are you asking what
Areas.
Yeah, but are you asking what South Korea is promoting?
Yes.
What type of
Well,
projects?
I don't think necessarily South Korea is promoting anything multilaterally. They're not necessarily promoting anything regionally. They're promoting individual projects in each of the countries. So,
In your view, what type of assistance that South Korea is probably could have implications regionally?
why I don't think there is. I mean, that's the point. I mean, I think the Navoy is one example. But as you point out, there is competition among the republics themselves, so that they're not necessarily particularly happy to share. I happen to think actually that transportation hub does have implications, and that it absolutely has implications to develop the other surrounding republics. There's perhaps a different viewpoint. I don't think South Korea is necessary. I don't think South Korea's strategy is necessarily meant to encourage regional development. I think the strategy is to develop in each individual country, and whether or not that has regional implications, I don't think there's anything purposeful about that. What I will say is, I think China is absolutely trying to do that. China, for example, is developing railway projects that actually goes through and links Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And so there are attempts to try to do that, but those are not South Korean initiated. So, I mean, I think the answer to your question is no, I don't think South Korea is doing anything to purposely link any kind of regional.
I think Korea's point of view about Mongolia is a little bit different. My experience is that basically Korean strategists over the past 20 plus years see Mongolia as a Northeast Asian country. They don't see it as a Central Asian country. So they see this as a large country full of natural resources with low population, so that they need to provide the natural resources to the region, but they need from the regional players both the technology and they need the manpower. So Korea has always been part of the discussions on the Tumen River concept of the free trade zone, which is something Mongolians have always been interested in, are interested in. Even the Mongolian idea of using North Korean labor now as a replacement for Chinese labor. And Mongolian policy is very complicated because basically Mongolia welcomes all foreign investment, including Russian investment. The only investment it doesn't want now is China. But it can't say that and be in the World Trade Organization because of World Bank people like you. So as a result, they have to discriminate now against everybody. Although the only foreign investment they don't want so much of, I mean, it's not that they want to throw all the Chinese out, but they just don't want 80% of their economy in the hands of China. They want it back at 35. So the only way they can change the picture, they've told me, is first of all, you take the pie and you grow the pie. which means you've got to bring in new investors. And the only way you bring in the new investors is you have to take your mineral resources and basically pull them out of private hands, which the Americans encouraged them to do before in the 1990s. You renationalize them. It's a strategy that Putin used in Russia. And then in state hands, you can then subcontract pieces of it out to favored countries whose FDI you want. So now that's the strategy in the past 3 or 4 years. And South Korea, because it's interested in the Northeast Asian region, because they have direct involvement and feel they'll have direct benefit from it, I think are beginning at least to understand what Mongolia is trying to do with the transportation of rails, because it doesn't make any difference in Central Asia if they get the uranium there, if they get the uranium in Mongolia. You've got to get the uranium out of that country, which doesn't have infrastructure, and get it to the market. And if the market is South Korea, fine. But you still have to get it to South Korea. And as Mongolia has figured out, against World Bank instructions, very strong instructions and ADB instructions, don't build your railroad gauges to Russian standard, but put it to Chinese standard. They refuse to do that because they don't want to tie in more to the Chinese economy. And now they're using loans and asking South Koreans and Japanese, partner with the Russians because you have better relations with the Russians than the Americans ever will have. You know how to work with them. You think they're difficult to work with, but compared to the other alternatives, you have better knowledge. And number 2 is you have self-interest. You build those rails, you make those relationships with the Russian companies, railroad companies, then you will get those goods out across Siberia to you and to other markets. So I do think for Mongolia's point of view, there is a strategy, and I think that especially the rail development strategy links well with Central Asia.
This is really fascinating because Central Asia is having the same problem. I mean, you look at this map, there's this talk about linking, from London. Basically, you could get on a train in London and go the Orient Express, right, all the way to Venice. Basically, eventually, all the way through Central Asia, through China, all the way down to Busan, right? You get on a plane, London, and then a week later you could end up in Busan through Central Asia. But the question is, and China wants to link this railroad, the question is this issue about gauges.
The gauge.
And linking it through Russia, but do you do it to link through the Chinese gauge system or the Russian gauge system? And now there's this big fight about who's going to fund it. And yeah, it's interesting. Who knew?
I think we have time for one last question, so maybe we'll take both and have the speakers answer both. So over there in the back.
My name is Heather Wallach. I'm from the U.S. Department of State, Office of Central Asian Affairs. And my question is primarily about Central Asia, but I think maybe Dr. Campi can speak a little bit from the Mongolian perspective. Opportunities for coordination and engagement with U.S. policy priorities in these regions and South Korea. As you've made a reference to in your paper, the sort of human rights, good governance, anti-corruption issues, you talk about how South Korea can be a democratic model for development. But in practice, is this actually linked to assistance to loans? And is this actually, in practice, part of South Korean engagement in the region? You mentioned that South Korea does not have a regional strategy, is not promoting regional economic integration or infrastructure integration, which actually is a cornerstone of U.S. U.S. strategy and U.S. policy in the region, as Secretary Clinton calls the New Silk Road vision. So could you speak a little bit about what are the practical possibilities for U.S. and South Korean cooperation?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the question about the U.S. perspective as well, but we'll take that last question and answer together.
Thank you. Hi, I'm John Zhu with the Legal Daily of China. I have 2 questions for each of the panelists. For Dr. Hwang, I wonder how would South Korea deal with the dominance, as you mentioned, of China and Russia in the Central Asia while engaging with that region? Also, what's the stance of South Korea towards Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because more and more countries are showing interest for being part of that. And for Dr. Campi, and you mentioned that Mongolia, I wonder what has Mongolia done in facilitating inter-Koreas for the region, and also what kind of role Mongolia can play on the North Korea issue. Thank you.
These are very big, important questions, but we have about 3 minutes left, so.
You want to go ahead?
Well, I will send you to this Jamestown article, which it was just released today, which in detail talks about what Mongolia has done in brokering discussions, which are involved in the six-party talks. But, and that will give you much more details. But in general, okay, in terms of North Korean, South Korean dialogue, Mongolians are, first of all, they see the country of, the peninsula of Korea as one country, one people, which they have a relationship that exists far beyond the past 20 years or 50 years. So it's an 800-year plus relationship. And right now we're just in this phase where the two peoples are separated, not unlike, from a Mongol point of view, the way they view their own separation between North Mongols, we call them independent Mongols, and South Mongols that are in China or in other areas. So the present disagreement, the present differences in form of government from a Mongolian perspective are something that they have empathy for because they feel that they face the same issues. Secondly, I think that Mongolia has determined, I actually did a study for the East-West Center in the summer, made a presentation. When you're talking about resource nationalism and how does that fit into the area and how does it affect Mongolia's attitude, Mongolia is considered, right now, it's in 2011 was the fastest growing economy in the world, and yet people make statements such as things are all falling apart because the Mongolian government is doing anti-investment things, and there was an issue of a big Chinese company, Chalco, which was not allowed to legally take over a perfectly legal business contract for a Mongolian coal company, and that these would depress the Mongolia's growth rate. And I was discussing all of this with Mongolian policymakers and the mineral authority people in June, and the bottom line is the Mongols want to depress their growth rate. They want to reduce the foreign investment, and they want to diversify the foreign investment, always having a place for Russia and for China. And they see in reality now the only countries in the area that can truly help them change the balance are either Japan or Korea. And the closest port, they got to get out of they don't want the Chinese port. Doesn't do them any good to send it way off to Vladivostok. The closest port for them is a North Korean port. So they feel now a personal reason why they should be involved in getting peaceful relations on the Korean Peninsula so that they can use this North Korean port and as its access to the markets that can pay for the minerals in South Korea or Japan.
Well, I'm a little embarrassed now because the real expert was sitting over there the whole time. So, look, your question is really critical. And the one thing that I didn't address was that the real beauty of South Korea's engagement in Central Asia is that it has this ability to serve, and the beauty of as part of being Korea's global Korea strategy, is that it has the ability to serve this incredible purpose of supporting the broader U.S. Korea alliance. Right, and the strategic goals of the alliance, which is increasingly converging. Now, having said that, I do think you bring up this inherent this paradox. and this problem that was brought up by our World Bank colleague, which that Korea's engagement of Central Asia is primarily, it's basically not strategic. I mean, China's interest in Central Asia is far more than economic. It is essentially strategic, it's geopolitical, and it is broadly, when I say it's economic, it's existentially economic. I mean, it involves China's internal domestic national economy because it's related to China's Xinjiang province. And so for China, Central Asia's economy is related to China's domestic economy. Okay? For South Korea, it's related to, its search for natural resources and so on. So it serves its broader economic interests, but it's just a portion of it. And Central Asia does not serve South Korea's geopolitical or strategic interests. And so it's not really approaching this in any kind of broad strategic way. And I think if it were, then perhaps it could fit in a little bit better with U.S. interests. So it does have to tread very carefully because I think you're right. I don't think it is necessarily implementing its economic engagement with the sort of very high standards of all of these kinds of, human rights. I mean, if it were actually, I don't think it probably could not deeply engage the way it were. And so it comes down to, no engagement or engagement. I mean, this is the trade-off, right? So. But I think again, and that's the question. Either South Korea engages and allows these countries to have some economic development, or it doesn't, and China and Russia continue to engage. So, but I think South Korea, and that's the challenge. I would just say that.
I just want to put one sentence in regarding Mongolia and the cooperation between ROK and United States. Basically, there was a donor assistance program mechanism set up by the United States, but carried out in Tokyo starting in 1991. That was a mechanism for the major democracies to give donor assistance, which was divided without fighting, without everybody trying to get the power plant stuff because they saw it as a future way to get involved in various Mongolian activities. So these sectors were divided up in a collegial way, and every year in Tokyo, the donor nations, starting in 1991, worked together about how to give development assistance to Mongolia. And since Mongolia received more per person development assistance than any country in the world, including Haiti or Bangladesh or anything, and for economic reasons, people also benefit. This mechanism enabled the ROK, as well as Japan and the United States and Europe, to coordinate their policies. So they're much more coordinated because they had the experience of donor aid, which now has moved into other areas such as military cooperation. So the United States has assisted Mongolia in building up its military mechanisms and training of UN troops, in which the South Koreans participate and many other nations participate, and China's even an observer, Russia's an observer. And so in terms of development of the different economic sectors, the United States, Korea, and Japan still have a lot of coordination. United States, particularly on the civil nuclear issues, and particularly the very difficult topic of waste. Nuclear waste has taken the brunt, been the face of the negotiations, representing both Korea, Taiwan, Japan. Because in the end, unlike maybe some of these other sources, the Mongolians only want to deal with other superpowers. Well, Japan and South Korea, from their point of view, aren't superpowers. They're just rich. Anybody can be rich. But they want to deal with superpowers, and they don't see too many others out there besides Russia, China, and the United States.
Well, I think there are so many different issues that could be drawn out from both of their presentations. So we will continue to study this region and these topics that were mentioned today. So let's give a round of applause to our speakers.